But the Republic debate is now being raised rather gently, I think, given the situation. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, a staunch Republican himself, has said he won't be pushing for a Republic referendum in this term, with his focus solely on the Indigenous voice to Parliament. Professor George Williams wrote about this in The Australian this morning, saying if the voice succeeds, the Republic will take centre stage as the likely topic of Australia's next referendum. However, if the voice fails at the ballot box, it's hard to see there will be immediate enthusiasm for a second vote. The fate of these two nation-building reforms is intertwined with an Australian Republic depending on the success of Australia's upcoming referendum on the voice. George Williams joins me now. Good to talk to you, George. I think that's an interesting bit of analysis from you. I think it triggered my thinking. I think it's absolutely right. Even though these are entirely different reforms in many ways, they are now intrinsically linked.
Look, they are, and I think it's a matter of common sense that if you spend maybe $100 million on the voice and it succeeds, that's going to build momentum for the next vote. But if it fails, people are going to wonder about whether we should spend a like amount of money on another vote. It's also the political capital. For a government to run a second referendum after failing in the first is a very large ask. I think more likely they'll focus on other issues and somewhat beaten and cowed will go back to the drawing board without rushing to a new referendum.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, especially on the voice. If you were to lose the referendum, you'd lose a lot of political capital. That'd actually be quite a divisive result in this country. So you don't even want to run it until you know you can win it. And I think he's got to really lift his game in the argument about that so far. Is there any hint you get that the voice referendum might be delayed because of the, I suppose, lack of impetus in the campaign so far?
I think it's still likely to be in the second half of next year. I've never bought that it might be held as early as May next year, which symbolically would coincide with the 1967 referendum. And I'd say the second half of next year, because to run this well, I think will take 12 months to build the case, to get the proposal through Parliament, and to make it clear that this is a community-based proposal, not something that is owned by Labor, and Labor is asking people just to back it as opposed to the community's proposal. But equally, I'd say I wouldn't take much more than a year either. There's a lot of energy that goes into these. It's easy to dissipate. And I'd say you run it for 12 months, give it your best shot, and don't let it go longer than that.
Yeah, I think Labor's got a lot of work to do in terms of convincing the argument on the issues of substance and giving people detail. But of course, a couple of weeks now, we're not going to be delving into that. We'll see what they do in the months to come. What do you think of my observation at the top of the program? It's just struck me over the last couple of days. You have the monarchists arguing strongly, defending that exclusive power that rests in one family in Britain. And at the same time, they're saying you can't possibly have a voice because that gives special rights to a certain group of people.
Yeah, look, it doesn't make sense to me, those two things. They're in stark opposition, of course, and I'm a Republican, and one of the reasons is because it just doesn't sit easily with basic Australian values that anyone would even hold a position by virtue of their birth as opposed to their merit. But you're right, by birth, our monarchs hold this tremendous power. They are impartial, but nonetheless, it's a powerful position. In the UK, the person gets to meet with the Prime Minister once a week to advise, to warn and to influence. And there's lots of examples, both our Governors-General, our governors, and also the monarch themselves, that these are very impactful, influential people. You also can look to Prince Charles himself through the spider memos, as they're called, where he lobbied government ministers. You can look to his public advocacy. He has been able to leverage his birth and his role, even as a prince, for influence. And again, it speaks that the monarchy is not just impartial, it's a very significant, symbolic and powerful role within our system of government.
George, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
George Williams with those insights, Professor of Law at the University of New South Wales.